Welcome to Soundtrack Your Life, a podcast about soundtracks, music, and movies. Each episode features a guest and focuses on a specific soundtrack and the personal stories connected to it. Now here's your host, Ryan Pack.
So this is Soundtrack Your Life. I'm Ryan Pack, and this is a podcast where I talk to a guest about a soundtrack that they have a connection to. Today I will be talking to JM Brandt, co-writer of the upcoming horror comic Swamp Dogs House of Crows, and that'll be coming out on the Black Caravan imprint. So welcome, JM Brandt, and why don't you tell us a little bit about Swamp Dogs House of Crows?
Okay, a little bit about it is the Swamp Dogs are the meanest, cruelest Confederate soldiers that ever existed. And they are resurrected by a voodoo curse, or a voodoo hex, I should say, and in present-day Louisiana, and they come up against a young lesbian couple and a goofy metal band in what's basically like a horror movie, like a grindhouse 70s, 80s horror movie.
Very cool. And so when should we expect to see Swamp Dogs at our comic book shops?
Good question. There is an ashcan preview comic, and if you're unfamiliar with the ashcan format, it's like a little miniature-sized comic book with a handful of pages, and we have some exclusive pages in there, but other pages just taken from the first issue. That comes out sometime in July, and then October 2021 is when you will see issue 1 in the stores.
Seems like they're trying to line that up with Halloween.
They are, yeah. They're really excited about the book. They're telling us that we're the headline book of the year, and if there was an in-person Comic-Con, then we would be their guests of honor there.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, no, it's very humbling, considering it's my first comic. I'm, really, really stoked at the attention that it's getting.
And also F the pandemic for you not being able to go to Comic-Con.
Well, there's going to be other conventions, and there are other years too. I'm not going away anytime soon, and the series, like this part of the series, ends in May, if I'm not mistaken. It's 5 issues, and so I will be at next year's San Diego as long as Delta variants and other variants don't keep us from, all being able to hug and kiss one another in San Diego.
So fittingly, today we're going to cover our first horror soundtrack for the podcast, and we're talking about Dan O'Bannon's The Return of the Living Dead. So JM, why are we talking about The Return of the Living Dead?
We are talking about Return of the Living Dead because when I was thinking about music in horror, and not thinking about scores, of which there's like a bunch of really good ones. The horror movie that I equate with music the most is Return of the Living Dead. If you were to like give an elevator pitch for it, you would just say it's a punk rock zombie movie. And, I have a history of being too into punk rock, especially growing up, and so it's just a great synergistic use of music in a horror movie, and I think it gives it a very unique vibe as far as horror movies go.
Yeah, I agree. I was really surprised with how well the music works with the movie. I'm not a horror aficionado, but I'm familiar with a lot of the famous horror scores of the last 30 years.
Right.
So I was actually surprised that it's not like a novelty within the film, like it's meant to kind of fit in the movie.
Yeah, it's definitely very tone setting, and one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I'm guessing we'll talk about this more later too, but a lot of the punk that they chose is really jaunty and sort of like party centric, and I think that For those of you who are listening that haven't seen the movie, this isn't like a I'm going to wet my pants and not be able to sleep at night kind of horror movie. This is like a horror comedy, more than anything. And so the music is party centric in that it kind of wants to let you know that you're supposed to have a good time with the movie, as opposed to like being terrified of it.
Yeah, and obviously you have a lot of the characters who kind of fit in that punk rock scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's not like just kind of a random choice.
Right, yeah, no, it's not like a period piece from the Victorian era and there just happens to be punk rock music playing over it. It's not like some sort of weird Sofia Coppola movie. It's it's about a bunch of punk rockers that happen to be at the wrong place at the worst possible time.
And that time also happens to be a birthday that you and I share.
Yeah, that's right. July 3rd, 1984, which is not the year that we were born, but it is the birth date of both of us. And that's something that I get a kick out of every single time I see it. And I even know it's coming, and I still, for whatever reason, July 3rd just feels nice. And I don't know if other people that have other birthdays feel nice when they see it in fiction. But I do, because I kind of feel like it's a forgotten date, if that makes any sense. Like, I feel like it gets swallowed up by the 4th of July. Like,
oh, yeah, I totally agree.
That a 3rd of July even exists. So I just kind of like that it's there. And also that nobody talks about the 4th of July in the movie before everything goes to hell. It's kind of like they forgot that the next day is a holiday. I think in the very beginning they talk about there being a weekend that they're about to be in, like, like let's close up for the weekend, but they don't say for the holiday weekend.
Yeah, I remember like when the internet was first a thing, like looking up my birthday to see like what famous people were born on July 3rd.
Mm-hmm.
Like I definitely had a fascination with that date specifically. And obviously seeing it in this movie, even as we push 40, I was like, it's my birthday.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's why I have like sort of a fondness for Tom Cruise, no matter how off the rails he goes or like how weird things come out about him. I'm just like, him and me, we have the same birthday, so he's all right.
Yeah, I probably haven't looked up famous birthdays on July 3rd since I was like 12, but I remember like, oh man, Tom Cruise is born on July 3rd too.
That's the only one I remember. And yeah, like I think everybody's guilty of looking up who shares their birthday. Like, how could you not? Because you want to see, I think in it, you want to see if you can tell something about somebody's personality or explain away something about the public persona of a person based on their birthday, based on what you know about yourself. Is that fair?
I think it's pretty fair.
Okay. I can't explain away Tom Cruise. It's fun to try.
Yeah, that's for another podcast.
Yeah. I just think if you're born on July 3rd, you're a handsome devil. And that's the bond that all three of us share.
And we're not like 6'6".
Oh yeah, and that. Yeah, short but devastatingly handsome.
So you grew up in LA.
I did.
I grew up a good amount of my childhood in San Diego.
You did.
It's a very Southern California-centric soundtrack.
Yeah, it is, which is interesting because you find out that it is not in LA where the story takes place, which I always found fascinating because, even before I really realized that the bands were in Southern California or like were very Southern California-y, it felt very LA to me. I don't know why. Maybe there's that scene where the punk rocker Suicide. I only ever remember like 3 names out of this whole movie, but Suicide is driving everybody around, and it looks like they're near the LA River. and so I just kind of assumed that it was LA. But yeah, I think it's in like Louisville.
Yeah, I think it's in Kentucky, but they shot it in Bakersfield.
Oh, okay. So I don't know where they were driving then, but it just always had a very LA River kind of vibe to me.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. But yeah, the bands are very Southern California ish for the most part. Like TSOL, I know I just kind of like, when I think of them, I think of Southern California right away.
Right, they're a Long
And
Beach band.
45 Grave also.
Yeah, like I don't think Roky Erikson. I think he's from Texas.
Yeah, Austin, I think. And the Damned are British. And I don't know, are the Cramps from San Francisco?
They're actually New York.
They are. Okay. See, I mean, that's kind of a weird thing about me, is I had my teenage punk rock phase, and I was also very into some rockabilly stuff, and like very much into the aesthetic, like the death rock kind of punk rock stuff. Um, and everybody I knew that I like appreciated and liked, they all had, if not like a fascination with the Cramps, they at least had a Cramps phase, and I could not, for the life of me, ever get into them. And I even tried, because knowing that we were going to film the podcast, I was like, let me give the Cramps another try. And I just don't really see it.
I always get the Cramps and the Muffs mixed up. Not that they sound anything alike.
I think it's because once a month the Muffs get the Cramps. Sorry, a bad menstrual joke there.
So SSQ is also on the soundtrack. They have 2 songs, and I get a kick out of. So I didn't see the movie until you mentioned wanting to talk about this for the podcast, and I was like, SSQ, who's that? And so Stacy Q is from SSQ,
Mm-hmm.
and she had a very popular song in 1986 called Two of Hearts.
I love that song.
And she is from Fullerton.
She is. Okay. I didn't know that.
And a few years ago, my band was playing this little free music festival in Fullerton called the Day of Music. And I remember my friend was like, "Oh, I'm gonna go see Stacy Q. She's playing. She's gonna play Two of Hearts. Like she's doing a free show on like one of the bigger, like promenade areas."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know Stacy Q was from here." So it was kind of a kick to see that SSQ is on a horror movie soundtrack.
Yeah. 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 I had no idea the Stacy Q connection. And I mean, that song always stood out to me, not just because, and spoiler alert, there are boobs in this movie, not just because the SSQ song comes on during the boob part, but it just like, it didn't seem to match the vibe of a lot of the rest of the music. It always felt a little bit out of place. So to find out that it was like this 80s one hit wonder pop princess new wavy kind of thing, um, makes it make a little bit more sense. And then I kind of, when you dropped that knowledge on me outside the podcast, I kind of went into who the other people in SSQ were. And I guess like the other main brain behind it has a lot more punk rock connections than just being on the Return of the Living Dead soundtrack. So it made a little bit more sense.
And I guess they put out a new SSQ album in 2020.
Yeah. For all those people clamoring for the SSQ return.
I guess that Day of Music show went really, really well.
Yeah. Yeah. Everybody that was in Fullerton just like was chomping at the bit for Stacy Q to resurrect her project that nobody ever heard of.
So the movie. So like I said before, I had never seen the movie, but
Yeah. Sorry. What did you think of the movie? Like, not being a horror movie guy, right? I am dying to hear what you thought about this.
the movie felt strangely familiar. and not in a bad way.
Uh-huh.
Like,
Like you knew
maybe,
it from another life.
yeah, like maybe, or maybe I had seen it in like high school at a party or something. Like,
Okay.
there's a lot that felt familiar about it, from, Frank, totally trying to, like, you knew Frank was like going to cause this thing at the beginning of the movie
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
with, the government stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like maybe it's because like this is what you expect in zombie movies. Like maybe it kind of like it started a lot of these tropes, maybe.
Yeah, I feel like it's responsible for starting a lot of the tropes, but also carrying on some of the tropes, or expounding upon the legacy or extrapolating the legacy of some of the tropes, but also playing with them a little bit too, right?
Yeah, so I wouldn't consider it predictable, but it feels familiar.
Right. It does have a very cozy feeling to it, and I think that I felt that way even after the first watch, and now, God, I probably first watched it like 25 years ago, maybe longer, and even then it felt like a worn-in glove, like a really, really good mitt. And I've probably seen it like 20 or 30 times since then.
Yeah, I can see that. Like I understand why it's a cult classic. I can understand why they made many sequels after this.
Yeah, yeah, they did. I don't think I know for a fact I haven't seen all of them, but I have seen the first three in the series.
And even though, they're hamming up quite a bit, like Frank is just so hilarious to watch at the beginning of the movie.
Oh yeah, no, he's great. Like, it's been easily 20 years since I watched the movie with the commentary on it. But I seem to remember something about that scene where Frank and Freddy are going through the warehouse together. I recall a lot of that being ad-libbed. I think a lot of it's ad-libbed.
Yeah, the camaraderie between those two actors is pretty great.
Yeah. Well, spoiler alert, they're in the second movie together, too.
I think I only knew that because I was like looking up what else the actors have done. I like that Frank's most notable credits are in these Living Dead series movies, and then I guess he was in The Pursuit of Happiness.
Yeah. Maybe I'm cheating by having a computer open while we're talking, but I see also that he was in Poltergeist and Mulholland Drive, but I can't for the life of me remember him in either one of those. Yeah, I guess it's just The Pursuit of Happiness in that. He passed away not that long ago, I feel like. And, oh yeah, 2018. And I just recall every single horror obit about him being this wonderful character actor best known for the Return of the Living Dead movies. So I think this kind of like ingratiated him in everybody's mind.
Yeah, he's kind of like the friend's dad that you work with.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, like that first scene really develops sort of the feeling between Frank and new hire Freddy, and it's this sort of like ball busting, but like a paternal ball busting, right? It's
Yeah,
like, oh,
like I'm gonna make sure you work 8 hours, but then like I'll buy you a beer afterwards.
right, yeah. And then also, just like setting up the premise as being like, oh, it's this young punk rock teen's first day at a medical supply warehouse. Look at all this weird, creepy stuff that we're going to throw at you. I can't help but feel like if you were in a medical supply warehouse, you would get exactly that same kind of hazing on your first day. Like it doesn't even matter who your supervisor is. Like I think the creepiness factor coupled in with the absurdity factor, like yeah, isn't it bizarre that it has to be somebody's job to ship cadavers to medical schools? Like you almost have to force a sense of humor on it.
Oh, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that was kind of the point of Scrubs. Like, it's this very depressing show with like these very absurd moments of comedy, because that's kind of how you keep yourself sane working at a hospital.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's a gallows humor that you have to adopt, right?
So take that, exponentially for working in.
Yeah, a place with split dogs and skeletons. Definitely. Definitely. I mean, as far as horror movies go, it's like one of my favorite openings. And, I've seen too many horror movies, if such a thing could exist. I've seen too many. And it's still one of my favorite openings just because it puts you into this like really foreign atmosphere that at the same time feels very casual and comfortable. And it's just a great premise, and also just like a really bizarre geography to this city, that it would be like this medical supply warehouse right next to a crematorium, right next to a cemetery.
Credit Dan O'Bannon for working with efficiency as far
Yeah.
as his sets.
Yeah, exactly. Like it all has to be real close together so people can run from one to the other. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the name Dan O'Bannon, he's also the guy that wrote Alien, and I think co-wrote John Carpenter's Dark Star, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, he definitely had something to do with Dark Star.
Yeah. Yeah, and he is, or maybe he was in it. Maybe he was in Dark Star. I don't know. I don't care enough to double check. But I do know that this is like his one big directorial effort. Like, he did other movies, but this is like basically his only.
Yeah, this is his baby, right? He got to write and direct this movie.
Right. Yeah. And it really shows like some of that same sort of humor from like a John Carpenter type movie, or even Alien, at the times when it's not super dark.
And I am confirming he was the writer on Dark Star.
Okay. Are we
Yeah, he
too
actually
far?
came out with a screenwriting book after he passed away.
Oh, wow. Okay. I will have to read that, because I have a feeling like he and I would have gotten along very well together. Based solely on this movie, by the way. Just like, yeah, I want to make a horror comedy about punk rockers meeting zombies. I mean, I'm doing a metal band versus undead for my book, so I'm not too far off.
Kindred spirits.
Yeah. Well,
You could have hung out with him if you went to Chapman for college.
yeah, I could have done that, but then also I would have gone to Chapman for college.
It says in 2001 he was the filmmaker in residence.
I don't know what that means. What does that mean?
I'm
Like,
looking
are
it
you
up.
making films about the college? Are you just being paid by the college to have your name associated with it?
I think so.
Okay. I want to be the something in residence of something. Can I just be the horror guy in residence for this podcast? Soundtrack Your Life?
That's an interesting concept. I think every time I do a horror film, I should have you on as kind of a horror expert in residence.
Yeah. Well, I hope I can live up to the mantle. I hope that you're not just paying me to have my name associated with it.
I don't have enough money, so you better be good.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me on this, by the way, and sort of being my very first podcast that I've been on.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, thank you for being on the podcast.
I have a pretty busy slate ahead of me, but talking about a movie that I've seen as much as I have really, really helps.
So on Spotify, I could not find the soundtrack. There's obviously playlists that have bits and pieces
Right.
from it. But it's a pretty popular soundtrack, right? Like it's not, it's not the Bodyguard soundtrack or Purple Rain, but like I feel like it has like an important following.
Yeah, no, definitely. I would say within the horror community, Return of the Living Dead is a pretty well venerated movie, and one that's very closely associated with the music that's in it. So it is a little bit interesting that it hasn't been reissued and put on a Spotify, and given that whole kind of love. And I have to imagine a lot of it comes down to licensing problems. Because one thing that I think that can be said about punk bands, or like old school punk bands, is that they are terse and difficult to deal with occasionally when it comes to the appropriation of their music. And what I found really interesting is, outside of Trash's theme, which is just like kind of a riff off of the SSQ song that's in there, the other song that's not on Spotify is from The Damned, who I would probably call the biggest or second biggest band on the soundtrack, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I would say The Damned, and I don't know, is TSOL or the Cramps bigger?
I would say the Cramps are bigger. I think your proximity to Southern California maybe has warped your sense of TSOL's popularity. I think in the punk rock community, like if you're a punk rocker or you associate with punk rockers, you're going to know the name TSOL. And I feel like every once in a while, a Hot Topic would have a TSOL shirt or something like that. Um, but I would say it's firmly in the lower tier of punk rock bands that people first trot out to show their knowledge or credibility. It's not in the Sex Pistols, Damned, Clash tier, but like one below.
That's fair. I mean, I think I'm just used to hearing them playing around town all the time, so I was just
Right.
like, oh, they must be popular because they're always on tour.
Well, I do think that they're popular. Like don't mistake that. Like I think they're really popular, and they were in Penelope Spheeris's Decline of Western Civilization, so they have that going for them too. Um, yeah, actually, the Damned were my favorite band in high school, and TSOL was very, very high up there. And I think at this point, I probably listen to more TSOL than I do pretty much any old school punk band. They have this like one unheralded album that I find myself going back to time and again, called Beneath the Shadows.
I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, it's like I want to say it's like mid '80s, and it's as they're sort of getting a little bit gothier. I'm looking it up now because anything I say may or may not be true. And it looks like it's from 1983, so it's actually earlier than I thought. And there's a lot of piano in it, and a lot more
TSOL and
singing.
piano, huh?
Yeah, like piano and keyboard, and it's really good. It's the singer is not a good singer, but for what he does, it is good, and he does a lot of singing as opposed to just shouting.
Oh, got it.
Also, the font that they use for their name on the album cover is the Clockwork Orange font, so they get bonus points for that.
Oh, absolutely. So another reason that this soundtrack may have a lot of red tape as far as getting re-released is it was originally released on a label called Enigma, which was based in Southern California. But like they've been acquired multiple times by other major labels. For a label that I wasn't very familiar with till we started researching for this podcast, they released Motley Crue.
Wow.
So they
Okay.
did Motley Crue's Too Fast for Love. They are known for the Christian rock band Striper.
Awesome.
And also some old Red Hot Chili Peppers albums, and they released Sonic Youth's Daydream Nation.
You forgot to preface Red Hot Chili Peppers with the term Christian.
Yes, the Christian rock band Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Christian rock band Red Hot Chili Peppers.
So like a lot of big names for a label that doesn't have that sort of reputation like an SST.
Right, yeah. Yeah, in fact, I think when you asked me if I knew which record label put it out, I thought you were baiting me with an SST answer. Because, like, that's, I think, the first label that comes to mind when you think of punk, right?
Yeah, like SST, Epitaph.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, at least old punk, it would be SST, and then probably Epitaph after that. By the way, just because I'm doing 62 things at once, I want to correct myself so I don't come off sounding like every other jackhole on a podcast. I was wrong about where TSOL is in terms of Penelope Spheeris's filmography. They were featured in Suburbia and not Decline of Western Civilization. So, listeners, I am sorry.
There's multiple Suburbias, right?
Yeah, well, there's like two main Suburbias, and there's like the old school punk rock one, and that's a Penelope Spheeris film, and that's the one that features Flea as an actor in it, and it's like, whoa, Flea can act, and that one's really good. And then there's the sort of, God, I forget who did it.
I think it was Linklater.
Yeah, it was Linklater. Yes, you're right. Because I was going to say, I think it's Linklater. He did that one, and that's got Parker Posey in it, and that is also good.
It's a pretty crazy journey of this record label that was basically started by two brothers.
Two brothers. Interesting. You know, I kind of never understood, like, maybe you have a better relationship with your siblings than I do. Like, I love my siblings and everything, but I could not imagine going into business or doing something professionally as an adult with either one of them. I think my siblings and I push one another's buttons too much. And there's, like, too much rivalry gone into adulthood for anything to succeed. Maybe that's why Enigma's not around anymore, but who knows?
So recently, we did High Fidelity, and that soundtrack has the 13th Floor Elevators, which is a Roky Erikson band.
Is it Rocky or Roky?
Roky Erikson. I think most people just call him Roky Erikson because that just sounds more rock and roll.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, I didn't want to say it wrong. I like saying Roky, but I will say Rocky.
So I saw High Fidelity when it came out, but as far as like really getting into like who Roky Erikson was and who the 13th Floor Elevators were, that didn't come until, maybe in the last 5-10 years. Are you a fan? When did you get into his music? I find it kind of fascinating that I feel like there's an upswing of interest in him.
Yeah, I think his death really brought about like some extra attention on him. Rest his soul. I honestly wasn't super into him or his band or anything for a long time, and then I went and saw Yola Tango did this series of concerts that were kind of like a Q&A, and I forget exactly what they called it. But basically, it was like they would play a song and tell a story, and then play a song and tell a story, and it wasn't their usual set list. And then they would open up the floor to questions and answer them, and then play a song based off of what their answer was or what the question was. And they played a 13th Floor Elevator song, and it really piqued my interest. And so I kind of did I don't want to call it a deep dive. I did a middling dive into his musical history and came away with like some real gems. Like I'm not going to sit down and put on like a Roky Erikson or a 13th Floor Elevators album all that often, but I definitely stole some choice cuts and put them on playlists and stuff. And his story is, yeah, really, really interesting and really fascinating. And I'm always kind of astonished and morbidly obsessed with people that have like stints in mental institutions and also are like public musical personalities. Your Sid Barrett's and your Daniel Johnstons and your Dr. Octagons of the world.
Yeah, I don't think I was too familiar with his work, and then I was at a show and Nick Oliveri came out, formerly Queens of the Stone Age.
Mm-hmm. I saw
And
him at a liquor store in Burbank once, and he gave me a "you know what's up" nod. And that's like one of the highlights of my life
he has
because I
a
lived a sad life.
he has a two-headed dog tattoo. They
Oh,
pointed that out.
I didn't realize you were following that up with tattoo, and was going to be flabbergasted for a little bit. Sorry, so he has a two-headed dog tattoo.
Yeah, and that's a reference to Roky Erikson.
Oh, okay, awesome.
So I was like, oh, he's like a big deal to some people that are a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. I love that class of person. The big deal to the big deal, right? Like there should be some kind of a hall of fame for them or something. It would be like Rocky would be first ballot, and I think the Melvins would be first ballot, and Can and Os Mutantes. Like
Yeah.
I think that's what you're starting the hall with, and everybody else can come after that.
I think Nile Rodgers.
Oh yeah, yeah, or yeah, your Nile and your Giorgio, and like the music, like true musical pioneers, definitely.
Did you know that Giorgio wrote both Highway to the Danger Zone and Take My Breath Away from Top Gun?
I did not know that. No, I was actually just blowing somebody's mind with the whole he did the Neverending Story music.
Oh yeah, he did do that too.
Yeah. Can you imagine being the guy that did Take My Breath Away and the theme song to the Neverending Story? Just imagine it.
Outside of Frank, who we already
Yes.
talked about, I think I saw a recent picture of the guy who plays Freddy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, oh, you're like an adult now.
Yeah, yeah. I do have IMDb just like popped up because for whatever reason, even after 24 viewings or however many dozen viewings, I still don't get most of their names. Like most of the punkers' names, right? Like Suicide, I know because they refer to suicide as suicide, and also it's kind of cool to have your name be Suicide. And Linnea Quigley is Trash, and I know that. And I know Freddie and Tina because they're the adorable couple. But all the other ones, like, I don't know who's who. And so I was looking at IMDb and I was looking at their like portraits, and I could not recognize basically anybody. I was like, Brian Peck, who is that? What does that guy look like? Who is Scuzz? I don't even know which one Scuzz was. And then like I would have to do some work to figure it out. And then the only other one that I know for sure, just off the top of my head, is Miguel Nunez, because he's the only one that went on to do stuff where I would have looked up a movie he was in specifically to find out who he was.
Yeah, it seems outside of the horror circuit, not a lot of these people had the most profitable careers.
Yeah, I mean, Linnea Quigley is a forever scream queen, and is worth checking out a lot of her films, right? If you're sort of a horror newbie or whatever, and not just because she tends to get naked or close to naked in many of her films, but just because she's kind of like one of the more interesting personalities that shows up in horror movies. And then, yeah, I would say outside of her, Miguel A. Nunez Jr., aka Spider in the movie, is the only one that went on to have like a really successful career. I guess you would call his career successful. I mean, he was Juana Man.
Yeah, I mean, as like we can scoff from the outside as much as we want, but he's had consistent work for a very long time.
Yeah, and not just like bit parts too, right? Like, I mean, Juana Man was a leading role, so any leading role in a big theatrical run movie, no matter how worthy of being made fun of it is like a big deal. And just the fact that somebody of his stature would have a title role in a movie is pretty remarkable. But yeah, like anytime he's a character actor, he's like a very prominent character actor, and I think he's like really good in everything that I've seen him in. The other ones may very well have had like a very good career over these last few decades, but I couldn't pick them out of the lineup, you know? Like, I don't know John Philbin and what John Philbin has been in. I love you, John Philbin, as Chuck, but you don't have the name cachet of a Miguel Nunez.
Yeah, Don Calfa.
Yes.
I mean, he's been in a ton of things outside of this movie.
Right. Yeah, like the guys that were not like the punk rock kids, I think, are more likely to be recognizable and have had like bigger careers, right? But
Right.
I just mean as far as the kid crew.
Right.
You know, I don't want to like come off as like, oh, I was like this big ass punk rock kid. Like I wasn't. I listened to a lot of punk rock as a kid, as a teenager. I had a hoodie with a lot of patches on it and pins. I carried around an ammo box for my lunchbox because I thought that was cool. But I wasn't like, I don't know, what's something super credible that punk rockers do? I don't know. I hung out with a punk rock crowd. I listened to a lot of punk. I had some punk trappings, but I don't know that I'd ever have called myself punk. But what I found funny, like having been at least cheek to cheek with the punk rock crowd, is the mixture of verifiable actual punk rock stuff and activity out of these actors versus like the Hollywood version of it. One of the things that I think is like most interesting in movies, and also it's a big pet peeve of mine, is how authentic people seem in their roles. Like whenever you have like a bunch of gangbangers or something, I'm like, oh man, like I smell the community theater on you. Like you're not from the streets, you are from the suburbs. And it's similar with punks and the way that punks are depicted. And I think a lot of that comes down to the people that are in charge of costuming or maybe directing. They want a punk character, but they're not familiar with the institution of punk. And I think in this movie, it's a pretty good mixture of the two. Like, there's a lot of stuff that these punks do and say and wear that would never happen. But in my mind, it's kind of more of a caricature than it is like just misreading of the scene.
Yeah, and I think everything is, played to be a little over the top.
Yeah, I mean, this movie is a caricature as far as I'm concerned. Like, everybody is like a bigger boob than they actually would be in real life.
Right. Frank sets the tone for the movie.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Or when like the zombie gas gets out and then you have the I won't spoil everything, but you do have like the butterflies that are pinned inside the case and all of a sudden they're fluttering. like everything is a little bit cartoony. It's a very cartoony movie.
Yeah. I mean, you have Spider, trying to fight someone in the backseat while he's driving, and someone else has to grab the wheel. And
Yeah. Yeah. I think he might be my second favorite character in the movie. Like if I had a top three, it would probably be Frank number one, Suicide number two, and then Tina number three. And Suicide, like, I think I like him because of his soliloquy where he's talking about, like, oh, you think this is a uniform? Like, you think this is, like, just for show? This is who I am. This is my identity. And then he's got Linnea Quigley, like, nakedly dancing all over him, but he kind of doesn't give a shit. And then I just like that he's got, like, big ass chains hanging from everything. Like he has a chain going from his nose to his ears, but it's not just like a little tiny like a charm chain or something. It's like full on, I don't know, construction site chain. Like what would you even call those links?
like a bike chain? I don't know.
Yeah, he's got like a bike chain going from his nose to his ears.
Maybe he saw Mad Max and got really excited.
Maybe. I do kind of like how the punk aesthetic wound its way into post-apocalyptic and vice versa. Like, I think that's a real nice meeting of the minds there.
Yeah, when they're driving that car, maybe because it's in the Bakersfield desert, but I did kind of have a Fury Road sort of feel.
It feels super bombed out, doesn't it?
But there's just not that dude with the guitar with flames.
Right, yeah. Yeah, there's no, oh god, I wish I remembered that character's name. He's got, like, the best name in the world. But yeah, there's no pole vaulting psychopaths in the movie. Just the one that decides to stop driving in order to grab somebody in the back seat.
But I feel like it wouldn't have been out of place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a little bit. One of the things that I wanted to bring up about that scene in particular, this like driving through Bakersfield, which is essentially a bombed out wasteland, is that the music in that scene is really loud. Did you notice that? Like, did you notice that while watching the movie? Like, you can't even really hear the dialogue over it. And I don't know how intentional that it is, but I think it gave a lot of focus to the music itself at that point. And then also, like, I think it was unintentional. I think it was just like bad sound mixing. But it kind of gave me the feeling of being crowded into a car with a bunch of other punk rockers, just kind of without a direction, kind of like a joyride. You know what I mean? Like, it's like whenever you piled into a car in high school, the music would always be louder than was tolerable, and you wouldn't be able to hear what anybody was saying. And you just kind of like would have to nod your head or say what 1,000 times. And I think it did a really good job of that.
Yeah, I think it kind of emulated like what was playing on the car radio or tape deck.
Yeah, I think so. Honestly, I think that might even be my favorite use of music in the whole movie. One of the things also that I wanted to mention about like the music in the movie is this is the first time that I sat down and watched it with the music in mind, right? Like the music was always an accompaniment. Let me start over. An accompaniment to the movie and not the star of my focus. And this time it was, because that's the point of this podcast, I think. And I didn't realize how much of a mirage the soundtrack is. It's like all these teases. They don't play any one song for all that long. And the use of punk rock in it, the use of like the non-synthesizer score, really is infrequent. but like it has overall the feel of this like very cohesive, very music driven kind of movie. What is there? Maybe 5 minutes total screen time where punk music is being played over the movie.
Well, you are limited to 34 total minutes of music if you were to use all of the soundtrack.
Yeah, that's true too. But I mean, like it's a blip of a minute and a half song as opposed to um, anything more substantial.
Yeah, that's true.
It's funny that you brought up Roky Erikson because he's like the sore thumb in the soundtrack, isn't he? Like the SSQ is a little out of place, but it's kind of understandable. But then Roky Erikson had nothing to do with it. Like he was an outsider, the same way that I guess punk was an outsider genre. Um, but he wasn't punk, and he didn't come up in the same era. And you had talked about like how um, the music wasn't played as a novelty throughout the movie. But the Roky Erikson song, I think, was a little bit. Like, it feels like they only picked it because it happens in a scene where a person is about to burn up, and they turned up the volume in the song just enough to hear Rocky say, "Burn the flame," and then they turned the music down. So
Yeah.
that was kind of like a novelty. It's like, oh, what song do we know where the person very clearly says something about burning or being on fire? Let's just use that.
Yeah, and it's a 6-minute song.
Yeah, yeah. It's like the longest song on the soundtrack, isn't it?
Oh, easily. The next longest song is 4 minutes and 11 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost 2 minutes longer than the next longest song.
Right. Yeah, my son is school aged, and I was listening to the soundtrack, and he knew that I was going on a podcast about the soundtrack. And he knows that it's a scary movie, and he's not allowed to watch scary movies yet. So he had asked me, like, oh, what's the movie about? And I said it was a zombie movie. And he assumes that any movie that's called The Living Dead refers to all undead. And so he's like, so are there ghosts and skeletons and stuff? And I was like, no, there's not any of that. But then we're listening to the soundtrack, and in the Roky Erikson song, it talks about vampires and ghosts and stuff. And he's like, well, the guy's singing about vampires and ghosts, like, so they're in the movie too, right? And I had to explain that not everything that anybody sings in a song in a movie comes to life in the movie.
Unless it's a musical.
Yeah, unless it's a musical. And then even then, is it always like a one-to-one?
There are metaphors, I guess.
Yeah, there are metaphors. So I just thought it was interesting, and it's definitely an outlier in the soundtrack, which is kind of interesting considering his like sort of outlier outsider status within like cult music period.
Yeah, I was surprised that it was kind of a ballady sort of song.
Yeah, yeah. But also like kind of jaunty, right? Like I kind of feel like every song in this soundtrack, even the ballady one, is a little on the jaunty side.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe that's just the positive vibes that I associate with the movie. I will say that, virtually every movie about like an invasion of something features like a scene about boarding things up, like boarding a place up. And they play this like very, very happy, jaunty is the word. Like I use the word jaunty. I'm probably breaking the jaunty record for podcasts. Uh, they play a tune that's like very upbeat, and it kind of lends this feeling of fun to the boarding up scene that I don't think you would have in another horror movie. And I almost feel like that board up the window scene is like a requisite for horror movies where you're just sort of like fortifying yourself in or barricading inside of one location. And it's usually a bit of a slog. It's like, well, we have to put it in there so that you know that they're protected, so they're not terrified every second that they're indoors. But this one was like kind of fun because it was like party music at the same time.
Yeah, that's true. Like I said, I don't have like the greatest encyclopedia of horror tropes. So I'm like, that seems fine.
Yeah. No, the barricading yourself is definitely a trope in horror movies. Because I mean, what would you do if you were under attack, right? Like you would barricade yourself.
Oh, I have a question for you as the expert and I am the noob.
Yeah, noob away.
So when the movie started, I knew Frank was going to get them into some trouble.
Uh-huh.
But I was actually kind of surprised that Freddy is not the hero of the movie.
Ah, yeah. No, that's true. He very easily could have been the hero. And I do like that it kind of like takes the concept of the hero and plays with that a little bit. You know, who it is that they wind up using and who winds up surviving towards the end, who's the final girl kind of a thing. Girl in quotations. But also at the same time, I kind of feel like that intro sets up Frank and Freddy as a comedic duo. Like that they're the blundering fools together. You know, like they're an Abbott and Costello, they're a Fred and Barney, they're a like it almost feels like they're in bed together in whatever mayhem they accidentally get themselves into.
I guess the way that I was expecting things to unfold was they set it off, but they kind of also have to save the day.
Right. Yeah.
But instead, they're just taken out pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah. Well, quick and slow, right?
Right. But, you know, with Freddy having the girlfriend who's coming to see him, you know, I just assumed that he would have to, like, save her and save Frank from turning into a zombie or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. You want to automatically assume that the strapping young lad is the hero, and I do kind of like who winds up being the hero or the couple heroes, I guess you would, and that it's not like the young ones necessarily. It's a little bit more democratic that way. Probably closer to the truth too, honestly.
Yeah. Well, I'm just glad I wasn't misreading it. Like,
oh no. Like I would say in a typical movie that would be it, and like the only thing that you would have going against it is just that Freddy doesn't seem very bright and seems very in on whatever mischief and mayhem Frank is trying to get themselves into. And I think one of the things that I find interesting about horror movies is that a lot of it is a morality play. And also, like, intelligence is kind of treated like a moral issue as well. So if you do something that's immoral or amoral, you have a very high likelihood of not surviving in a horror movie, right?
right.
You know, the killer goes after the couple that has sex, or the killer goes after the one that does drugs. But also stupidity. Like, also curious stupidity tends to get punished. And so the fact that there is a tank featuring government mishap that's like in their basement, and Frank is like, hey, do you want to go poke the bear and go see this like hideous experiment that was accidentally left here? And then Freddy goes along with it. Like, in most horror movies, I think that is a death sentence. Like the fact that you're like, yeah, let's go do this dumb thing. Like you're putting a big X on your head at that point.
Good point, JM Brandt. So, JM Brandt, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And just to remind listeners, they can keep an eye out for Swamp Dogs House of Crows. That'll be coming out on the Black Caravan imprint in late July and in October of 2021.
Yeah, issue 1, October 2021. That's the ashcan. You're not as likely to be able to get a hold of it. It's very limited release. If you're unable to find it at your comic book store, you can always go to swampdogscomic.com. That is swampdogscomic.com. Or you can go to the publisher, scoutcomics.com, and they will have it there as well. But what would help me out more is if you asked your local comic book store to carry your book.
So, JM, if my listeners want to see what you're doing on socials, can you give a plug for your Twitter or whatever else you're using?
Absolutely. I'll do Twitter and Insta because I'm not one of those people that post the same thing to every platform. Twitter, it is at MRJM Brandt, BRANDT. So that's Mr. JM Brandt with no periods. And then to make things a little confusing and bad for branding, my Instagram is j.m.brandt. So at j.m.brandt.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. And if we do another horror one, maybe I can have you back to
be the horror in residence.
To be the horror expert in residence.
Thanks for joining us this week on Soundtrack Your Life. Make sure to visit our website, soundtrackyourlife.net, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too.